Okay, we're live.
Thank you. I want to welcome everyone. I'm Beverly Bean, co-chair of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, Monterey County branch. We are sponsoring tonight's film and discussion along with the Peace Coalition of Monterey County. We are very lucky to have Sharat Lin with us to lead the discussion after the film, when I will introduce him. In April 1915, a unique group of women met in an international congress in The Hague, Netherlands, to protest against World War I, then raging in Europe, and to suggest ways to end and to prevent war in the future. The organizers of the Congress were prominent women in the International Suffrage Alliance, who saw the connection between their struggle for equal rights and the struggle for peace. Wilf's foremothers rejected the theory that war was inevitable and defied all obstacles to their plan to meet together in wartime. They assembled more than 1,000 women from warring and neutral nations to work out a plan to end World War I and lay the basis for a permanent peace. Out of this meeting, the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom was born. Our first international president was Jane Addams, founder of Hull House in Chicago, and the first US woman to win the Nobel Peace Prize. Today, WILF is the oldest women's peace organization in the world. It is an international, non-governmental organization in over 35 countries. WILF International has offices in Geneva, Switzerland, and New York City, and works to achieve, through peaceful means, world disarmament, full rights for women, racial and economic justice, an end to all forms of violence, and to establish those political, social, and psychological conditions which can assure peace, freedom, and justice for all. Not a small task. A Bold Peace is tonight's documentary film about a country with no military. In 1948, Costa Rica abolished its army and invested in health, education, and the environment. The film features former presidents, Costa Rican government officials, scholars, journalists, and citizens of Costa Rica. Let's watch this film now.
That is made, every warship launched, every rocket fired signifies, in the final sense, a theft from those who hunger and are not fed, those who are cold and are not clothed. We pay for a single fighter plane with 500,000 bushels of wheat. We pay for a single destroyer with new homes that could have housed more than 8,000 people. This is not a way of life at all. It is humanity hanging from a cross of iron. This is one of those times in the affairs of nations when the gravest choices must be made if there is to be a turning toward a just and lasting peace. It calls upon them to answer the question, is there no other way the world may live?
I'm on.
65 years ago, the small Central American country of Costa Rica did something unlike any nation before. It abolished its own army. Costa Rica invested in social programs, developed widespread literacy and access to schools and universities. The people enjoy universal health care, and they now live longer than the people of the United States.
We don't have army. We don't have army because we have a social program. We don't have army because we have national health system.
We don't have an army since 1948. And this is one of the great things that happened to this country, because we don't spend any money on army. So we can use that for health services, for other services that the state provides.
We were able, because of the abolishment of the army, to create an army of teachers and of students in Costa Rica, and to create a social health care system that covers the whole country.
Una de las consignas a la hora de quitar nuestro ejército fue una mejor educación para todos.
Throughout the years, we've been discussing Costa Rica's decision to disband its army and invest in education and the effect that that's had. So we have high literacy rates, we have a well-educated populace, and education has been a pride of Costa Rica for many decades. And so their experiment, their social democratic experiment, has been marvelous. They shot for the pie in the sky, and I think they've achieved incredible things.
What does national security really mean? Costa Rica has wrestled with this question while living without an army for over 65 years. It remains the largest nation in the world without a military or a military base on its soil.
We have shown the world that it is possible for a country like ours to live without an army. It is not possible to arm ourselves and to develop Costa Rica economically and socially. We have to choose between rifles and tanks and electricity and roads. We have to choose between hospitals and schools and machine guns, and we have chosen already.
The most important consequence of not having an armed force in Costa Rica was the financing of public institutions, and most of them related to social well-being. In other words, the bonus of not having military was the capacity of the state to invest in the people.
We decided a long time ago to build a welfare state, while our neighbors instead built a garrison state. And in a way, the political stability, the social stability you find in this country is because most of the basic needs of our population are being taken care of.
Nuestra mejor propuesta ante el mundo es invertir mejor los recursos precisamente para que haya paz. Y para que haya paz es invertirla en salud, en educación y en lucha contra la pobreza. Nunca en un ejército, no.
I will be a happy father if I never see this kid in the military. I don't even let him play with weapons, the toy weapons. Actually, we're not made for that.
Soy muy feliz de saber de que nuestros niños aquí en Costa Rica, yo como madre, de saber de que ellos nunca van a observar fuerzas armadas ni guerras aquí.
There's a peace monument at the University of Peace in Costa Rica, and it says, "Happy is the Costa Rican mother who knows upon the birth of her child that she will never be a soldier." That's the essence of it. It's a deeply grounded belief that we will never be soldiers, regardless of what happens.
Costa Rica has been a leader in environmental policies.
Several years ago, Costa Rica committed to becoming carbon neutral by 2021, which is quite a bit in advance of the carbon neutrality commitment that other countries and increasingly many companies are undertaking for themselves, but who are attempting to do it by 2040, 2050, and some even after the second half of the century. Costa Rica's carbon neutrality pledge is not easy. It means revamping the transportation sector. That is where we have our highest emissions, and that is where most of the work is going to have to go. over the next few years?
Approximately more or less 1/3 of our country is protected.
Commitment of Costa Rica towards natural preservation, well, it's a recognition that what we have is not up for grabs. It's not something you can take away. It's something you live here. You enjoy living here.
Today, out of 151 nations, Costa Rica ranks #1 in the Happy Planet Index, a measure of environmental sustainability as well as human health and happiness. Additional studies show that Costa Ricans, or as they call themselves, Los Ticos, rank among the happiest people on the planet. One study ranked Costa Rica #1 in self-reported happiness and #1 in happy life years.
I think Costa Ricans are happy because we just take every day as it comes. We don't have to, I mean, we do plan ahead, but not as much. We just have fun and go with the flow.
I think that, like, with the globalization, like, stress and the way of living is like the same in the whole world, right? But here in Costa Rica, we chill a little bit more.
Some countries, they love to have war and with other countries, you know. We don't need it because we're not good for that, I think. We're not good. We're only good for party. The truth. We're only for party. So we all the people party, come bring them in here. Pura vida.
Sigamos la forma del tico, veamos que nosotros somos, le gusta el trato con todo el mundo, el vacilón y también nos gusta tomar las cosas en serio. Cuando hay que hacerlas en serio, las hacemos también en serio.
Costa Ricans hate conflict. They'll do anything they can to avoid it. So even when you see two men fighting outside of a bar, they might be calling each other bad names, but at the same time they're saying usted, which is you, with a sort of respect. So you can imagine expletive usted, which to me I think says it all. But yeah, Costa Ricans will do anything they can to avoid conflict.
With the money saved by having no military, Costa Rica has been able to preserve and strengthen its now decades-old systems of social security and universal health care. The healthcare system not only helps Costa Ricans live longer, it also costs just 15% of what the US spends on healthcare per capita.
Social security in this country is very, very important. It's one of the gifts that God sent for us, and we're trying to protect that. So here, the people pay monthly payment. So if you earn a lot, you're gonna pay more. If another person don't earn enough, it's gonna pay a little bit. You cannot pretend that everybody's going to earn a lot of money, because it's not real. It's just a fantasy, you know. If the people need to work in cleaning the streets, that person cannot earn a lot of money, but he deserves to get a social security at the same time, because you maybe can work in the office, but you need someone outside cleaning the streets. If you don't want to do that, somebody have to do that.
And it's very satisfactory that sometimes if you don't use that much your insurance, you're helping another people, and eventually another people is going to help you. Every person has a right to live and to be helped by their other people, like brothers and sisters, right?
It is surprising to me when in the US people say that they have to save so that their kids may go to college or to the university. Here we have a state university, and everybody that can pass the SAT may get in here. They don't have to pay for tuition. We believe that education and health is a right.
This is a country in which the value of solidarity is one of the most important values that we share.
Peace is not only absence of arms, no? It's also an attitude of non-aggression to the poor, no? Receive poor people, homeless people, no? To be attended in the public hospital. And the same, similarly in the education system, no? There is this attitude. I think that the education here has a lot of value of solidarity, peace. There's education for peace in general, no?
I think Costa Rica is able to make these very bold policy decisions, whether they be in the field of peace or whether they be in the field of environment, because we just have boldness baked into our cultural and political DNA. If it wasn't present before, it is definitely present after 1948, after the revolution that my father led, and where he just baked boldness right straight into us.
How did Costa Rica create such a peaceful society? The pivotal event of modern Costa Rica, the act of abolishing the military, was shaped by a series of struggles which shook the country to its foundations. As the world reeled amid a Great Depression in the 1930s and early 1940s, people everywhere demanded greater fairness and justice in their societies. In Costa Rica, a progressive vision of human rights and social guarantees emerged.
It's very interesting, 1940, we start with Calderón Guardia being president elected by 80% of the vote. And then he starts a change of a modernization of Costa Rica with the labor code and the social guarantee.
I think that the reason that we don't have an army is that in Costa Rica, thanks to the social reform, we have the conditions that make possible not to have an army, because all the social struggles disappeared. In other countries, in order to get a code of work, they have to fight. People die for that. In order to have a social security system. In Costa Rica, during my father-in-law government, Dr. Calderón Guardia, the social state was established. So it was easy to establish the absence of an army.
Costa Rica fought its last civil war in 1948. That war was the result of the opposition of the Costa Rican bourgeoisie to the social reforms that had been enacted since the 1940s by a very unusual alliance of the Roman Catholic Church, the Costa Rican Communist Party, and a sector of the Costa Rican elites. That coalition, led by a man called Rafael Ángel Calderón Guardia, resulted in the changing of the Costa Rican constitution to include a chapter on social guarantees, including the creation of the Costa Rican social security system, the reopening of the university, and the labor code.
In this window of opportunity before the Cold War, Calderón built a robust social welfare state with the support of Archbishop Sanabria and Manuel Mora, founder of Costa Rica's Communist Party. The coalition succeeded partly because Mora's communism was moderate and open to compromise. Calderón and Archbishop Sanabria were strongly influenced by the Catholic social teaching of their day, which led them to reject both the far left's utopian vision of communism and the far right's utopian vision of unregulated free markets. Their coalition with Mora sought a middle path to a good society.
That was a very successful alliance that lasted for almost a decade, until 1948, when in the elections of that year, former President Calderón attempted to run again for president, then upon losing the elections, decided to commit a fraud in order to gain political power again. And that was the drop that made revolution start. And as a result of that, and the desire of the Costa Rican elites to turn back the social revolution, a number of forces were unleashed.
All these reforms at that moment were not very well accepted because, of course, it affected the interests of the wealthy people.
But the elites did not count on the cleverness of the man who was going to lead the military effort, a non-military man named José Figueres Ferrer.
José Figueres Ferrer, known by all Costa Ricans as Don Pepe, was the main builder of the modern Costa Rica.
As a young man, José Figueres came to the United States intending to enroll at MIT, but instead he pursued a program of self-education. He often said that his alma mater was the Boston Public Library.
José Figueres was a very interesting character. He was extremely intelligent and he was a self-taught man. He studied in Boston. He generally talks about how much he learned by going to the Boston Library and the library in New York for hours and hours, reading in the libraries at night and working as a blue-collar worker in the morning. He learned and read extensively from the founding fathers. He liked to quote Jefferson. He also learned from the socialist utopians, the European socialists. By and large, I think that Figueres's philosophical roots were probably there. He also referred to the pacifists, Ralph Waldo Emerson and Tolstoy. So he was an extraordinary in the sense that he tried to apply those teachings in real life, and the influence was not small.
Figueres said his readings in the Boston Public Library set his mind on fire, dreaming of a more perfect world. It was here that he read H.G. Wells' book, The Outline of History. In the closing chapter, Wells advocates for a future in which there will be no armies, no navies, and no classes of unemployed people, either wealthy or poor.
That bright idea, that unique idea in the history of mankind to abolish the army, was not a bright idea that came out of the blue. That was an idea that was in him many years before that.
The influence of reading Tolstoy and the utopian socialists was decisive. When Figueres returned to Costa Rica, he immediately established a collective farm, which he ran much like a community cooperative.
He was, in 1942, a man completely devoted to his land, to his farm, and to his books. So, one of these paradoxical traits of José Figueres was that a man who was completely apart from politics became, at one moment, one of the main figures of the political history of our country. In the middle of the Second World War, there were some riots in Costa Rica, and Costa Rica was in shock. And Figueres rented a space in a radio station and made a very extraordinary speech.
In his address, Figueres denounced the government's incompetence and intolerance of political dissent. Before he could finish, police barged into the radio station, arresting Figueres and sending him into exile. While living in Mexico, Figueres became convinced that Costa Rican democracy was slipping into another tropical tyranny. And it was in Mexico that Figueres encountered pro-democracy revolutionaries who called themselves the Caribbean Legion, a band of political exiles from every corner of the Caribbean basin. They dreamed of overthrowing dictators in their home countries. Many were ex-soldiers, and Figueres came to believe their military experience might one day help Costa Rica.
Figueres had the sharp intuition, the political intuition, to say they are not going to give up power by democratic means. And that came true in 1948, when Calderón Guardia was one of the candidates, Otilio Late was another candidate. Otilio Late won the presidency, but Calderón didn't recognize the victory of Ulate. When the situation in Costa Rica was really terrible, a man who won the presidency but was not able to be a president, Figueres appeared in his farm with 7 other men. That was the beginning of a revolution that had the support of most of the Costa Ricans.
Now, Figueres drew upon his contacts with revolutionaries in Mexico, forming a pact with the Caribbean Legion. In return for helping install the new Costa Rican democracy, Figueres would offer Costa Rica as a base for overthrowing dictators in their home countries. As the Caribbean Legion secretly flew to Costa Rica and joined Figueres, he was poised to strike.
I was about 12 or 13, and one could feel the tension in society. I saw what I saw, and I know what I know. I know that the government was morally guilty, and that they tried to terrorize the population and to suppress the people who were fighting for the elections to be respected.
After 5 weeks of fighting and the loss of over 4,000 lives, Figueres and his revolutionary army emerged as the victors.
After Figueres comes in, he actually eliminates the army. But he didn't do so immediately. He did it after he was threatened by a coup of his own men. his Secretary of Security actually tried to make a coup in order to go back to the times that there was no labor code, there was no social guarantees, and he tried to actually take a right-wing position against the previous changes that had been made in the government of Calderón. And Figueres had already pacted with the communists that he would not eliminate these things. It's called El Pacto de Ochomogo. And the Pacto de Ochomogo was what made it possible for Figueres to actually guarantee that the communists would disarm. So he first disarms the communists, then he eliminates the army, and then he disarms his own army that was expecting that he would go on to make war against the generals that were dictators in the rest of Central America.
As Figueres embraced demilitarization, he broke his pact with the Caribbean Legion. But in the years to come, Figueres took great risks supporting their efforts to overthrow US-backed dictators.
Upon winning the war, he decided to do two things that were going to be essential for the future of Costa Rica. One, in my opinion, the most important thing that has occurred in our recent history was the abolition of the armed forces as a permanent institution in the country, which was revolutionary in and on itself. But the other one was to preserve Calderón's social reform and enhance that reform, in fact, furthering it by creating a social welfare state based upon the logic of the New Deal and Keynesian economics. That combination of a disarmament on the one hand and the blending of social concerns with the modernization of the state in order to have it take care of the common good was one of the most significant events in Costa Rican history and explained the country's stability for over half a century after that.
In a ceremony on December 1st, 1948, Figueres abolished the army using a sledgehammer to strike a symbolic blow against the battlements of the nation's military barracks. It was at once visionary and grounded in ideals as old as the hills. A century before, the founder of Costa Rica's republic, José María Castro, had warned, "The sword is the enemy of freedom. Let us not give it power." Concluding the ceremony, Figueres gave a brief speech.
The regular army of Costa Rica, which is the successor to the Army of National Liberation, surrenders the key to these barracks to the schools to be converted into a center of culture. The junta of the Second Republic officially declares the dissolution of the National Army because the security of our country is sufficiently protected by the police force. We firmly maintain the ideal of a new world in America. To that country of ideals of Washington, Lincoln, Bolivar, and Martí, we wish today to declare, "Oh, America, other countries, your children, also offer you their greatness. Little Costa Rica wants to offer forever, as now, along with its heart, its love of civility and democracy."
It's a very short speech, like the Gettysburg speech. He knew that he was talking to history. He knew that he was doing something extraordinary. Anybody can say, "How you dare to do that? You have a lot of enemies. You have powerful enemies." He was an enemy of the main dictators of the Caribbean basin: Somoza, Trujillo, Batista, Pérez Jiménez. They hated him. So how a man with this kind of enemies abolish an army? Is a man who is so brave. That's why he was able to do something that is unique in the history of mankind. A victorious general who abolished his own army, surrounded by powerful enemies.
Don Pepe, why are you abolishing the army? Tell us your reason.
Why not? Most nations need an army like they need a hole in the head. Costa Ricans have always been devoted to democracy. And now we practice this belief by dissolving the army.
What about the dangers of communism?
Militarism is as grave a danger as communism.
After the Civil War ended in April of 1948, Calderón and his allies, largely the Communist Party, were furiously repressed. And so many of the members of the former government, and clearly most of the combatants, left the country. Some of them, the leaders, went to Mexico, and a group of them stayed in Nicaragua, which was closer to home, and where they found the support of Anastasio Somoza, the American-supported dictator of Nicaragua for several decades. Very early on, Calderón and his supporters decided to start a counter-revolution against Figueres, based in Nicaragua.
From their base in Nicaragua, the Calderonistas sought to return to power in Costa Rica.
So there were two attempts that were made from Nicaragua to topple Figueres. One in 1949, less than a year after the triumph of Figueres, and the other one in 1955. Both had support of Somoza. And so Figueres was very successful in drafting a citizens' militia to fight against those two incursions from Nicaragua, and he was successful in both of them. He was one of the first presidents in the Americas to invoke the Inter-American Treaty of Mutual Defense of 1947, by which all the countries of the Americas would support any country of the region that was attacked by a foreign power.
With his mix of idealism and pragmatism, Figueres cast a vision of a more civilized world. When criticized for spending government funds on cultural and music programs, he remarked, "What good are tractors without violins?" In 1954, when his arch-enemy Nicaraguan dictator Somoza challenged Figueres to meet him at the border for a pistol duel, Figueres sent back a reply, "Grow up."
The army is a thing of the past. War is not normal in human life or in life on Earth or anywhere else. War is a fever. Peace is normal. Why not abandon the fever and the causes of the fever? War represents the tribal past of mankind.
After Figueres' victory in the Civil War, he led a junta, or interim government, for 18 months. In addition to abolishing the military, his junta gave women and Afro-Caribbeans the right to vote for the first time, issued a one-time 10% tax on the wealthy, and required the giant US corporation, the United Fruit Company, to pay taxes on its profits in Costa Rica. The junta also expanded the social security system. It nationalized the banks and the electric industry, which greatly increased people's access to credit and electricity. To further safeguard democracy, the junta strengthened an independent elections tribunal. The reforms forged a society with greater opportunity and equality. Claiming as his models the New Deal, as well as Denmark's middle-of-the-road socialism, Figueres said, "Our movement is really a revolution of the middle class."
The junta that my father led for just 1 year was led by his firm conviction and dedication to social justice. And they dedicated themselves to this very far-reaching network of institutions that provided social inclusion like it had never been done before in Costa Rica.
With democracy restored and the welfare state expanded, Figueres voluntarily walked away from power, turning over the government to the man widely considered the winner of the 1948 elections, Otilio Ulate. Figueres returned to civilian life, where he helped to form the Social Democratic Party of Costa Rica. Figueres would be elected to the presidency in 1953 and again in 1970.
I'm sure that if José Figueres would have lived in a bigger country like the United States or France or England, he will be a planetary personage. The things that he did in this little country, if he would have done that in a bigger country, I'm completely sure that will be a political figure of enormous transcendence in the history of mankind in the 20th century.
Don Pepe was
not only an entrepreneur, not only a businessman, he was a writer, he was a scientist, he was a philosopher, he was a politician, he was a strategist, he was a victorious general, and he was the man that also abolished the army.
José Figueres was the man who destroyed the armed force as a concept in Costa Rican political culture. I think we are quite clear in this country where the real base of our peace lies, and that is in the vision that Figueres and his generation had. I don't want Don Pepe to be forgotten by the new generations.
Having survived 2 invasions without a standing army, a still greater challenge to Costa Rican demilitarization came in the 1980s. Central America became a bloody battleground in the Cold War as the US tried to force Costa Rica into a protracted military conflict. With his back against the wall, Costa Rican President Luis Alberto Monge became the first president to proclaim Costa Rican neutrality, setting the stage for a high-stakes showdown with the Reagan administration.
President Monge came in 1982. There is the war going on in Nicaragua. Reagan is pressuring to use Costa Rica as a base to attack Nicaragua. The pressure of the United States was huge.
When the Sandinistas toppled the US-backed Somoza dictatorship in Nicaragua in 1979, the US government responded by sponsoring a counter-revolutionary force called the Contras. The US aimed to establish military bases in Costa Rica, giving the Contras a southern front against the Sandinistas.
The Contras were a wholly subsidized US-backed military group, mainly composed of former members of the hideous Guardia Nacional, the National Guard of the hated dictator Somoza. Reagan saw the Sandinista revolution in Nicaragua as a threat, the threat of a good example. If it succeeded, if they were indeed to establish a solid state where there would be more economic and gender equality, that might be a good example for other states in the region where there are gross inequalities to emulate. And so he immediately coupled the Nicaraguan revolution with Soviet communism.
To do nothing in Central America is to give the first communist stronghold on the North American continent a green light to spread its poison throughout this free and increasingly democratic country.
Costa Rica was threatened by the Central American crisis, which was the most important, significant political and military crisis the region had faced in its history. It was clear that Costa Rica could not withstand the pressures of the United States if it did not take the initiative. And one way to do that was by proclaiming its neutrality. And so the neutrality policy can be understood with this very Costa Rican attitude of taking distance from the United States without destroying that relationship. In fact, Monge was probably one of the most significant allies of the Reagan administration in Central America at the time. But this was preserved by taking distance from some of the administration's most aggressive policies. And even the recommendation at a time of Ambassador Jean Kirkpatrick of Costa Rica being forced to recreate the army. She suggested that very directly. And Monge stood back and said, no way. And the way in which he did that was by making the neutrality proclamation.
In 1983, in order to gain leverage against US pressure, President Monge turned to Europe, visiting heads of state and soliciting their support for Costa Rica's neutrality. Back in Costa Rica, President Monge declared the neutrality policy in an official ceremony, asserting that Costa Rica's tradition of peace made it a spiritual power. Monge's declaration was welcomed by the Catholic Church and almost every nation in the world. A poll found that 83% of Costa Ricans approved of the neutrality declaration.
The United States did not support the neutrality process, obviously.
The United States channeled all the money to support the Contras, to support civil wars, instead of looking into a civil movement to end the bloodshed.
US policy in this period was guided by the domino theory, which argued that if one nation turned communist, other nations in the region would quickly follow.
The Sandinistas had won, At that moment, the Sandinistas were supposed to be the danger for the rest of Central America because there was this domino theory that once one went, the others would also tumble. And of course, if it hadn't have been for the neutrality of Costa Rica being declared the way it was, and at the moment it was, Caspar Weinberger and Oliver North and other military of the United States would have put Costa Rica in the situation that it had already put Honduras. Honduras has one of the biggest military bases of the United States in the continent. It actually homed 36,000 troops in Honduras. If we would have been co-opted by the military, Costa Rica would have lost all its tradition of demilitarization.
As the Monge presidency ended and the civil war in Nicaragua raged on, Costa Rica's 1986 election became a national referendum on demilitarization. Would the Costa Rican people affirm demilitarization even as the Nicaraguan civil war was spilling across the border? Running in the 1986 election was the son of the former President Calderón.
In the campaign of 1985 to 86, when a new president was going to be elected, there were two visions that were confronted in that campaign. One that was defended by the son of former President Calderón, who was basically supportive of the US perspective. And the other one, by the name of Oscar Arias, who was adamantly opposed to the military solution that the US government pursued. And those two visions clashed in those elections.
During the election, the Reagan administration publicly threatened to end US financial support of Costa Rica if it continued its path of neutrality. Nevertheless, in a come-from-behind victory, Oscar Arias won.
Oscar Arias won with a very solid victory. That the Costa Rican populace was against the militarization of our relations and the militarization of Costa Rican politics altogether.
During the political campaign of 1985, in which I was very much involved, working with Oscar Arias, we made a lot of polls trying to know what was the thinking of the Costa Rican people. And it was fantastic what the Costa Rican people said. They were 80% of the people against the Sandinista regime. But in the same amount of people, more than 80%, they were completely against any kind of militarization of Costa Rica.
When I decided to run for office, I was 44 years old. And Central America was living a very bloody conflict where the two superpowers were involved, both the Soviet Union with Mr. Gorbachev and the US with President Reagan. And I decided to differentiate from my opponent. So I picked the cause of peace. The US government supported my opponent. Eventually I won. I won with the support of young people and women, because I used to tell the Costa Rican electorate that Central America was the region where mothers were burying their sons and not the opposite.
Costa Rica's ability to pursue peace and to resist Reagan's militarized Central American agenda now depended on President Arias.
During the Reagan administration, you had just flat-out zeal to promote war in Central America. There was tremendous pressure during the 1980s from the Reagan administration to get Arias and others to buckle down and get with the Washington program. The Reagan administration was worried that peace might break out in Central America.
Costa Ricans were completely against Sandinistas. Even so, we were not afraid. That's a very important national trait, national character. The paranoia, that is one of the paradoxical traits of the powerful. The United States is a very good example of that. It's a very paranoid country, and they are so scared about anything. And we had a very strong power just in the north of our border, and we were not scared. We were saying, no, we are not going to militarize our country.
Reagan said that Nicaraguan vehicles were only 2 days' drive from Harlingen, Texas. You just have to laugh out loud. What vehicles? They had no armored force to speak of, no air force, but it was used as a scare tactic to whip up fervor again.
Eventually, I was invited to the White House. It was December of '86. That was the first meeting with President Reagan. In the next 9 months, I believe I visited him 4 or 5 times, always to talk about Nicaragua. He was obsessed with the Contras. He referred to them as freedom fighters. And I kept telling President Reagan that the Contras were not the solution, but the problem.
Once again, Costa Rica turned to Europe for diplomatic support.
I visited almost everybody in Europe, from the Pope to Mrs. Thatcher. And against all odds, I was able to persuade my colleagues that the destiny of millions of Central Americans was in our hands, and that we simply couldn't fail. This is what I told my colleagues. I'm gonna lock this door here in this hotel, and we will leave until we have reached an agreement. And that happened on the 7th of August, early in the morning. When we went down to the lobby, there were hundreds of reporters from all over the world, and they were shocked when I told them, well, we had finally reached an agreement. I read the peace plan we had signed, and I could tell you that both the US government as well as the Soviet government were very upset. Then suddenly, I was honored with the Nobel Peace Prize in October. The Nobel Peace Prize helped a lot our cause. It was a signal to the world that what we were doing was the right thing to do.
It was the peace plan of Arias that finally moved Nicaragua, El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras towards peace.
The U.S. had openly threatened Costa Rica with a cutoff of aid, and Arias went to the people and campaigned and said, we're going to lose some U.S. aid, but we have to do this. We have to do this for our future. We have to do it for our national interest. And he was able to get popular support and defy the U.S. mandate for the region. I think Oscar Arias showed tremendous leadership and tremendous vision.
I am convinced that the pacifist culture of the Costa Ricans was the main trait that made possible for Costa Ricans to withstand the pressure that we had from the American government to try to be involved in a military intervention in Nicaragua.
In 2003, the US once again tried to draw Costa Rica into a military conflict. This time, the target was half the world away, and it would take a grassroots movement to keep Costa Rica out of it.
Secretary General Kofi Annan has now ordered UN weapons inspectors and other personnel out of Iraq. 250,000 American troops are poised to strike.
Events in Iraq have now reached the final days of decision.
There were moments when Costa Rica's vision wavered, or where Costa Rica did retreat to a more conventional vision of national security. Certainly, when we consider how, under the administration of Abel Pacheco, Costa Rica became part of the U.S. coalition of the willing to Iraq.
Coalition of the Willing was always a bunch of BS. It was sort of a PR operation, and it's a way of saying, we are the world, in a way. The Pentagon and the United States government represents the world. We all know that we are the strength, but we need a lot of others signing on.
In my view, the war on Iraq is one of the greatest atrocities of the modern period, to which no one has been held to account. The impunity of military and political leaders to international law, I think, speaks volumes to the collapse of morality in the United States today.
Abel Pacheco, when he was president, he was actually not very willing to get into the war with Iraq. It was our ambassador who came from Washington to the presidential house And he told Abel Pacheco, we have to go in. It's in our benefit. I mean, if Costa Rica, all they need is that Costa Rica say yes. We reacted very much against this because we were neutral. Supposedly, since 1982, a suit against the president was presented by a very good friend of ours. At that time, he was still a student of the law school.
It's 2003, President Pacheco is in office. He decides to issue an official support to the Coalition of the Willing, which was openly rejected by the population of Costa Rica, as polls showed, revealing numbers up to 99% of rejection of that measure. At that time, I was in law school, and I was talking with my friends, and somebody said, well, we're law students, we should do something. And I said, and we gotta file a suit against the president. And then everybody just had a reaction.
Zamora's classmates feared that taking legal action could have personal consequences, arguing that they might be banned from traveling to the United States for life.
The reasons for not suing the president were not really convincing to me, so came back home quite upset with everybody, wrote the suit and filed it. The court decided to take the case.
Although he was only a law student, Zamora won the case, forcing the withdrawal of Costa Rica from the Coalition of the Willing. In its ruling, the Supreme Court declared that support for the invasion of Iraq violated the Costa Rican Constitution and its tradition of peace. In 2010, on the river marking the border between Costa Rica and Nicaragua, Costa Rica's security model was again put to the test. In a shocking provocation, the Nicaraguan military suddenly occupied an island belonging to Costa Rica.
Costa Rican territory was invaded by troops of Nicaragua in October of 2010. It was a clear act of aggression against a part of our territory that had always been in our maps and international maps. Had Costa Rica had an armed force, that would have been war.
Initially, Nicaragua blamed Google Maps for the border confusion. But rather than retreat, the Nicaraguan military doubled their forces on the border. As the crisis reached into week 6, Costa Rica's president, Laura Chinchilla, marked the 62nd anniversary of Military Abolition Day by giving a speech that was unusual by Costa Rican standards. She called on Costa Ricans to join the armed force reserves and accelerated the training of border police.
When President Chinchilla realized her popularity was seriously sagging, she was losing it rapidly, she thought that promoting a nationalistic upsurge using Nicaragua's aggressive behavior as an excuse could help her.
René Castro was foreign minister at the time, and he, in the heat of the events, he suggested that Costa Rica maybe needed a defense force to prevent events such as the invasion from Nicaragua to repeat themselves. This view was overruled by a massive opposition from the Costa Rican public.
After the conflict started, when Costa Rica declared that Nicaragua had invaded Costa Rican territory, they took their case to The Hague in the International Court of Justice because Costa Rica is actively involved in international legal bodies, the UN, The Hague, human rights agreements. Costa Rica not only believes in those types of international legal frameworks, but actively participates in many different things around the world in order to promote the validity of those agreements. So this was a case where Costa Rica was actually referring to those international bodies for assistance. And I think that has helped to cool down the tempers that have been going on between Managua and San Jose.
When Nicaragua invaded, we went to the court. We trusted in the mechanisms, and the results are not only an outstanding victory of international law, but an outstanding victory of peace as an international policy and as a self-defense policy. Not one bullet was shot, and an international dispute is pending resolution without a war.
Although located in one of the world's most violent regions, Costa Rica has lived safely for over 65 years without a military. How has it worked for Costa Rica?
And when I was growing up, well, it was a very simple story. It was abolish the military to avoid the problems of the rest of Latin America, where the army has been an instrument of some groups to seize power. So we could get rid of those situations and dangers just by getting rid of the army.
For precisely these reasons, the mainstream media in the United States, including Time magazine, has often praised the Costa Rican model. Evidence of Costa Rican security in the absence of a military is found in the fact that Costa Rica ranks in a three-way tie for the safest country in Latin America.
Costa Ricans didn't seem to need an army. Why? We don't have enemies. This is the key issue to understand. Why we don't need an army? Who are our enemies? Nobody.
I do think the fact that Costa Rica has been army-free, military-free for so many years, which is now actually turned into generations, I think it has made us very conflict-averse, very friendly people, and we prefer to solve conflicts by negotiating with each other, by talking to each other. We just don't like this thing about taking to the arms.
While many Costa Ricans think of their nation as pacifist, the Costa Rican Constitution, as well as the national anthem, envision a nation with no standing army and a citizens' militia in emergencies.
If Costa Rica gets invaded, the president, by constitution, can call citizens to defend the country, and people will come.
Okay, so here in El Parque de la Hispanidad, we have a plaque that is dedicated to our national anthem. The national anthem is a commitment to have no standing army. The same as in the United States, the founding father, Thomas Jefferson, had proposed for a democracy that did not need an army.
In 1787, Jefferson wrote a series of letters urging James Madison to include a ban on a standing army in the US Constitution. But the final result was a clumsy compromise.
Jefferson saw that the concentration of power in the military could have deleterious consequences for the needs of a democratic society. The United States would use its military for acquiring land by force, for invading other countries.
A standing army, whether it's conscripted, whether it's volunteer, is really a welcome sign, a blinking neon message that we're here, we got to be used.
We hear a great deal of criticism because we unilaterally disarmed ourselves and put it into our constitution that armies are forbidden forever. It may be so, but the fact is that for 40 years we have used a substitute for arms and for armies, which is the international legal system. Just as you protect your home by calling on the police or calling on the judge or a lawyer, not by holding a gun, Costa Rica is protecting our country by applying law, international law. I think that we are, in that particular regard, a little bit more civilized than many other communities on earth.
Figueres abolished the army because he wanted to make Costa Rica's security an issue for international organizations. A few days after the abolishment of the army, Costa Rica became the 14th signatory of the Rio Treaty, and therefore the Treaty of Inter-American Defense entered into force. And that gives an idea of the importance that Figueres gave to international law.
Over the years, this national security design has been tested in times of crisis, and Costa Ricans have protected their country by appealing to international laws and organizations to arbitrate disputes. Critics allege that Costa Rican demilitarization is only made possible by the security umbrella of the US military. But that claim overlooks how often the US has destabilized Costa Rica and the entire region. It also overlooks how Costa Rica has cultivated diverse networks of support, often turning to Europe and Asia for diplomatic and development aid. The National Soccer Stadium was built as a gift by the Chinese government.
What comes to my mind when you talk about a culture of peace is the possibility of solving conflicts through diplomacy, through dialogue, through negotiations, and not through force. And to teach young people that it is always possible to try and try very hard.
Other nations know that any attack on Costa Rica would backfire, as world opinion would rally behind neutral, demilitarized Costa Rica. This is why Costa Rican presidents have sometimes referred to the moral force of demilitarization as a form of defense.
Our best defense is to be defenseless.
Not having an army doesn't make you weaker, but stronger.
Because
we are too weak to be invaded. Because our moral force is much more powerful than atomic bombs. No one can invade us. The entire world, the political opinion of the world, is our army.
My grandfather thought the same about moral force. He felt that soul force, moral force is much more powerful than any weapon in the world that we have created.
Although powerful nations have taken little notice, Arias undertook campaigns to export the Costa Rican model and to abolish the armies in Panama, Haiti, Uruguay, and several nations in Africa.
The Oscar Arias Foundation played a critical role in demilitarization in Panama and Haiti by holding a series of workshops, exchanges, planting the agenda. And this was a combined role with Oscar Arias' role in elite diplomacy and networking. Clearly, Panama and Haiti have not been able to demilitarize as completely and successfully as Costa Rica, but we have to keep in mind that the starting conditions were much more challenging in both of those places.
The fact that Panama decided to disband their army, I think, is a very positive step in the region. And following in Costa Rica's footsteps, it forms part of Oscar Arias' original vision before the peace accords were negotiated to have an entire region that was demilitarized. That was his goal and that was his dream.
In my peace plan in the 80s, my dream was to make of Central America the first demilitarized zone in the world. I failed to do that. I wasn't able to persuade my colleagues that they should get rid of the armed forces completely. I tried to persuade governments in sub-Saharan Africa to get rid of their armed forces, but I never got the support from the industrialized world. You know, I do remember many conferences organized by the Arias Foundation with defense ministers in Tanzania. I never got the support. You know, the 5 permanent members of the UN should be doing that precisely. If they are responsible for bringing peace to the world, they should be doing that. On the contrary, they are the main exporters of arms.
National security, at least to me, is not that complicated at all. It depends on how you frame it. But let's just get practical on this. Let's say we have an army of 10,000 people with $5 million budget for the entire year. And let's say that the United States decide to invade us again. Are we really going to stop the US? I mean, just one rocket costs more than what we can have as a yearly budget. Do you really want to have a self-defense force that is not going to defend you at all? It just makes no sense. Or let's say Mexico decides to invade Honduras. The Honduran army is not going to defend Honduras from a Mexican invasion because there is no capacity. So having military in small countries is ridiculous unless you are a member of the US State Department, in which you understand that small militaries in small countries are to give coups. So they elect a president that you don't want, then you have a coup d'etat, and you put... That's the only reason why there are small militaries. So the US can impose via coup d'etats the dictator they want. But it just makes no sense. What are we going to do with an army? Costa Rica, with an army. Are we going to attack somebody? No, unless it's the Cocos Island or Easter Island. Maybe we can invade Easter Island. We could, have a tug war there. It just makes no sense. And that's the brilliant vision of Figueres when abolishing the army. He said, this just makes no sense. Let's put the money in education and healthcare, and let's give a chance to development. Voila, you have the results in a stable country with high education levels, with fantastic technical education and university education levels, with solid democracy. The last elections just showed that the democracy is solid. It just makes no sense.
Look at the peace dividends here in Costa Rica. We are able to spend 8% of GDP on education. It's simply because we don't spend a penny on armed forces. There are 1 billion people who have no access to clean water. There are 1 billion people who are illiterate. With a tiny percentage of military spending, we could bring potable water to everybody in this planet, and we could educate every single body. I am convinced as a Costa Rican that there is nothing more perverse than spending our scarce resources in arms and soldiers if we haven't been able to satisfy the basic needs of our people.
I think Costa Rica is an example that the world needs to follow, that we disband military establishments and invest the money in human resources, and that we can live peacefully and non-violently with the rest of the world, show greater compassion for people and have better relationships.
Today, Costa Ricans perceive numerous threats to their culture of peace.
Lo que no les gusta a uno es los políticos falsos que tenemos, es lo que no me gusta. Que digamos, llega un momento que uno ya no confía en esa gente, porque todo el tiempo son mentiras y muy poco apoyo porque trabaja.
Nosotros aquí el problema que tenemos en la comunidad, que hay demasiada pobreza. Además de la demasiada pobreza, tenemos un problema con las aguas negras, que todas las aguas negras que cuando llueven salen por las aceras y no podemos ni caminar. La pobreza no da para tanto, el gobierno tiene que ver que lo que ha prometido, y estamos esperando esas promesas. Llevamos más de 20 años de estar en este problema. Como ustedes pueden ver, en este lugar, no es un lugar bien habitable.
Across town, extravagant new homes illustrate how far Costa Rica has strayed from its traditional social contract.
The wealth distribution is the founding basis of Costa Rican democracy. When you have wealth well distributed, then you have balance in the powers of society. And when you cannot impose over the other party, you gotta sit down and talk. And that's what builds democracy. And our political system was based on that material situation that we had to talk. That's how the founding of our democracy was so strong, and that's why democracy had been through a hole in the recent years, because economic disparity is just going crazy.
In my estimation, the biggest threat the country has is inequality. We are as unequal as we have ever been in our history. And this is a major threat. We are losing the capacity we had in the past of allowing income distribution to be part of Costa Rican daily lives by public education, good public health services. We were able to shape a society where redistribution of wealth allowed for the flourishing of democratic values. For me, that's fundamental to understand the human progress that Costa Rica was able to achieve after 60 years of a solid welfare state. But the logic of the welfare state was to allow the Costa Rican citizen to feel respected, to achieve a sense of human dignity. It was a society that was able to dream, to look at the stars. We're losing that dynamism, that belief that a better future is possible.
The world today of a 1% and a 99% is simply not sustainable. Society without a very big middle class is not possible. If there's no middle class to consume, how are you going to produce? How are you going to sell? Who are you going to sell to? Capitalism today is committing suicide because of the excess of concentration of wealth and the consistent destruction of middle classes. This is starting to feel like a pressure cooker, and every day there's more steam coming out. When in the south of the United States you have to build a wall, something ain't right. I may live in the safest, highest wall around me with all the security I want, but if my neighbor is not making it, I'm in real danger. He'll climb that wall.
In recent years, Costa Rican politics has been crippled by corruption, but a new generation of leaders is emerging. Among them is Luis Solés, a history and political science professor who is running in the 2014 presidential election. But Solís is part of a small political party, and Costa Ricans have not elected a third-party candidate in 50 years. With 3 months to go before the election, polls report that Solís has attracted only 4% of voters.
I'm running for president because I want to preserve my country's autonomy and do it well.
No es aceptable que un país como el nuestro tenga 1.300.000 pobres, de los cuales 350.000 viven en la pobreza extrema.
Con la judicialización.
Soy Luis Guillermo Solís, un ciudadano como usted, y sería bueno que empecemos a conocernos.
After the Central American Free Trade Agreement, or CAFTA, was signed into US law in 2005, Costa Rica faced mounting pressure from US officials to embrace free trade. As a result, in 2007, Costa Ricans voted on CAFTA in a national referendum. The measure passed by a slim margin, and it remains controversial as Costa Ricans closely watch the effects free trade is having on their culture.
Our social democracy actually did give a welfare state. This welfare state is being disassembled by all of this free trade neocons, and the worst part of it is that they're actually saying that we even have to privatize our Social Security.
The erosion of our middle class and the rising social instability is due to things like globalization, like the free trade agreement that was imposed on us. And you start seeing the effects of these things very fast. For example, the disappearing convenience stores in the neighborhoods. And at the same time, you start seeing big Walmarts all over the place. Walmart, which is the company that has more labor disputes in the world and has come to Costa Rica to do the same thing. And you see how globalization and the free trade agreement invade with all these multinational companies. We got a Starbucks in Costa Rica. And we produce maybe the best coffee in the world. And you want us to produce Starbucks? And now globalization and the free trade agreement bombard us with five-star hotels from multinational companies. They come in with all-included packages, so the locals can't see any benefit at all. So what we see today is that through all these processes of globalization, they undermine the possibilities of sustaining and growing our middle class. And that fundamentally is what is causing the loss of our well-being, the loss of our peace, the loss of our happiness.
The concentration of wealth is based upon the attitudes of a very small part of the population. They are the owners of most political parties, and the reluctance to do what they have to do in any democratic, capitalist, modern society, which is pay their dues in ways of taxes or allowing for public policies to develop without the resistance of their representatives in Congress. The logic of a lot of these elites has to do with this globalized notion that development somehow can be achieved by the private sector only, and that regulations to enhance these policies of redistribution should not be pursued. And that's nonsensical. I mean, the result of those policies, so-called neoliberal proposals of the 1980s and 1990s, clearly proved that after 20 years of enactment, those proposals result in crisis. There's no such thing as a democratic regime without the preservation of the common good. You cannot have unrestrained capitalism working within a society, because you'll kill the society and you will kill capitalism.
What we need is to put principles before profits. What we need is different values for the 21st century. I don't think it is fair to start a new century with the values of the 20th century, with so much greed, so much individualism, the lack of solidarity, the lack of compassion, so much cynicism.
American civilization has produced a type of human being called the businessman, who is very successful in making things available to many people, but all this has a price. There's a great danger of turning society into a good machine for producing goods and services and doing away with many of the spiritual aspirations of mankind.
While inequality and globalization threaten Costa Rica's tradition of social democracy, a new threat has emerged for Costa Rica's tradition of demilitarization, and there are no signs of it going away anytime soon. Just as in the past, it is a threat closely linked to the United States, the drug war.
We don't have an army in a time in which we have really serious problems with drug traffic. So we have our police corps, but sometimes we ask, is this enough?
Today in Central America and the Caribbean, we're stuck in the middle of a sandwich where we have drug production in Latin America, like Colombia or going south, and the biggest drug market in the world in the United States. It's a sensitive issue to us. Number one, because the United States has a history of invading any country they want in Latin America, of overthrowing any government. Secondly, because it's not any little boat that's coming in. There are military boats coming into Costa Rican waters and to Costa Rican ports.
The Costa Rican government will allow an arsenal of U.S. warships and infantry to set up shop in their country. But opposition leaders there are crying foul.
They're seeing that what's been authorized is a completely disproportionate amount of U.S. military force, and that it doesn't pan up to the needs of the counter-narcotics operations. And certainly, I mean, Costa Rica didn't ban having its own armed forces so that another country's armed forces could come in and take over the role of security and defense. I mean, that's not what's going on.
Acknowledging the drug war's notorious failure to reduce drug trafficking, Some Costa Ricans fear the drug war is merely a pretext for US militarization of the region.
The US ranks #1 in the world on weapons exports, far and away. No one even comes close to the level of money that the US generates from selling its weaponry around the world. So there's almost an institutional imperative to drive for war, to drive not for diplomatic solutions, but for military outcomes of what are, in most instances, political problems.
America struck its single biggest arms deal when Saudi Arabia ordered $60 billion worth of arms.
The Pentagon is sucking out what little fat there is left in the federal budget. And where is the money coming from? It's being cut from education, it's being cut from healthcare. People are asked to make more sacrifices. When is the Pentagon going to make a sacrifice? When is the military-industrial complex going to make a sacrifice? You know, aren't people sick and tired of the permanent warfare state?
Reflecting President Eisenhower's ominous warning of a military-industrial complex, the permanent warfare state demands ongoing cuts to social spending and education. This lack of social solidarity in the US fosters an unwavering commitment to militarism at home and abroad.
The permanent war economy has a ring to it because it rings true. We've lived that reality in the United States for many decades, but at the same time, it's a psychological permanence. The belief that we've got to have war, we've got to have the funding for war, and the notion of readiness is concentric politically and militarily with the emotional readiness to say, hey, we're ready for war.
We must stay on the offensive. We must be determined, and we must be relentless.
We will be relentless in defense of our citizens.
Diplomacy is now almost a dead letter in the United States. It is talked about sometimes, but it's just rhetorical gloss and sometimes going through the motions of jetting from one capital to another. Real diplomacy would involve healthcare, education, housing. We drop medicine and blankets on people rather than bombs. And also treaties against landmines and cluster bombs and small arms trade and large trade, and also the use of nuclear power, which leads to, through its export, nuclear proliferation.
For years, President Arias has promoted an arms trade treaty, which would prohibit the selling of arms to dictatorships and to governments who spend more on arms than on social welfare. In 2006, when the arms trade treaty was discussed at the UN, 153 nations supported it, 24 nations abstained, and only one nation voted against it: the United States. When the UN finally debated the treaty again in July of 2012, 51 US senators went on record as opponents of the treaty.
The arms trade treaty is badly needed and certainly a very noble attempt to put some kind of constraints on this out-of-control trafficking in weaponry around the world, which the US is the #1 arms trafficker.
In September of 2013, Costa Rica became the 5th nation in the world to ratify the Arms Trade Treaty. So far, the US government has refused to ratify it, and the prospect of ratification may be dim, since the US has the world's highest rate of failure in ratifying international agreements. Each of the following treaties ratified by Costa Rica still awaits a commitment by the US government.
Costa Rica ha firmado la Convención sobre Armas Biológicas.
Y también el Estatuto de Roma de la Corte Penal Internacional.
Y Convención sobre la Prohibición de Armas Uranio.
Y Convención sobre la eliminación de todas las formas de discriminación contra las mujeres.
Y el Tratado de Comercio de Armas.
Y Convención sobre los Derechos del Niño.
Y Convención sobre la Prohibición de Minas Antipersonales.
Protocolo facultativo de la Convención contra la Tortura.
Tratado de Prohibición Completa de los Ensayos Nucleares.
Pacto Internacional de los Derechos Económicos, Sociales y Culturales.
Convención sobre municiones en racimo.
Y Protocolo de Kioto.
Although it struggles and sometimes falls short of its ideals, we glimpse in Costa Rica a different way the world might live, the way of demilitarization, solidarity, diplomacy, and international law.
Protect all the people. We need to understand that we need to love each other, everyone, because I cannot protect just my family, just my friends. So we need to understand that maybe I don't have friends in some neighborhoods, but they are my people too. They live in Costa Rica too. They build this country too. They help this country too, and they are working for this country too.
The ultimate attitude of the country against armamentism, against the existence of an army, has to do with the process of sedimentation of values that have occurred since 1949 through this educational system. The Costa Ricans in general are adamant against the military. Once and once again, you find the limit between war and peace, between recreating the armed force and not doing it, in those profoundly grounded values of not having an armed force.
The world doesn't need to spend $1.3 trillion in arms and soldiers.
Violence does not, in any moment, prevent more violence or cure a society of violence.
We don't want to participate in wars. We want to develop pacific ways of solving conflicts.
Countries need a vision to follow, that everybody gets involved and will work for the same ideals.
The new cons want us to be their servants, or maybe just global consumers. We want to be global citizens, and that's why we uphold international law.
We don't have an army, and that means we don't have to be afraid of the army.
We believe that justice is stronger than war, and that the instruments of justice are stronger than the instruments of war. The degree of respect you have for international law is the degree of respect that other nations have for you, and by those measures, Costa Rica is a huge country.
In 2013, the Costa Rican soccer team qualified for the World Cup. They would later go on to reach the World Cup quarterfinals.
Costa Rica will play the Dutch in the quarterfinal.
And the revolutionary passion of José Figueres lives on in his daughter Cristiana, who now brings her visionary leadership to the global stage.
There is now a new UN climate chief as of the middle of May. She is Cristiana Figueres, a Costa Rican citizen, but also a resident.
Only governments can lead the world more rapidly to a low emissions future and prepare societies for the climate change already on the way. Governments need to continue to deliver this through the UN negotiations, every time taking bigger, bolder steps to keep us ahead of the storm.
This is it. We are running out of time. We have to get to an ambitious global agreement by next year.
I do feel that I'm following in my father's footsteps. There is something that runs through our veins, which is a fundamental confidence in international law. My father certainly was able to outlaw the army because he had trust that international law would come to Costa Rica's rescue should something happen. And I have devoted my life to international law in the field of climate change, where we are actually trying to get all these countries together to collaborate with each other and rescue each other out of a very, very unsafe zone that we have put ourselves in.
And the campaign of Luis Solís gained momentum in the final weeks before the election. He was endorsed by Figueres' son, Mariano, and Costa Ricans embraced Solís' promise to tackle inequality and corruption. In the end, it was said that Solís came out of nowhere to garner the most votes in the February 2014 election. 2 months later, in a runoff election, he was elected president.
Hemos hecho clarísimo, patente en nuestra historia, que la justicia social es la base del progreso, porque el pueblo de Costa Rica ha dicho, aquí estamos todas y todos para construir una patria responsable, inclusiva y justa, la patria de los valores eternos de Costa Rica. Con el hermoso abrazo de la gente, haciendo de la política un instrumento para todas y para todos, y de nuestra patria, el crisol hermoso, donde se construirá la Costa Rica del futuro, la Costa Rica de esperanza, la Costa Rica de alegría, que nos guiará al siglo XXI como un nuevo país, con una nueva Costa Rica.
Tonight, we are pleased to welcome Sharat Lin, who will lead the discussion about this film. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Great. Okay. Sharat Lin is a Ph.D. in medical physics. He is a research fellow at the San Jose Peace and Justice Center and its former president. He writes and lectures on global political economy, labor migration, social movements, and public health. He has been a peace and anti-war activist for 5 decades. He has observed firsthand how Iceland, which abolished its standing army in 1869, has been able to create a peaceful society where all human needs are met. He has been on the front lines of some epic moments in history, such as the Cultural Revolution in China, the beginning of the Lebanese Civil War, Palestinian West Bank and Gaza during the early years of occupation, Nicaragua after the Sandinista revolution, Egypt during the Arab Spring uprising in 2011-2012, and Kurdish areas of Turkey during the battles against ISIS. Sharat's work with the Human Agenda includes organizing emulation tours to societies whose best practices are radically different from our own and may serve as models to emulate. These include Finland, Iceland, Netherlands, Bhutan, Mondragón, and Costa Rica, among others. He is also affiliated with San Jose Peace and Justice Center and the Initiative for Inequality. Sharat, thank you for being with us today.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's always a pleasure and an honor to come back and address folks in the Monterey area, especially the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom there, and the Monterey Peace Coalition of Monterey County. So yeah, I mean at first I was a little bit hesitant to accept leading this discussion because I have actually never been to Costa Rica, myself, but because of these recent initiatives by Human Agenda, of which I'm now on the board, of leading emulation tours, and one of them that we haven't actually planned one yet, but it's on our agenda to organize an emulation tour to Costa Rica, and so we recognize that Costa Rica has made some really unique contributions, and to reorganizing itself towards social justice, towards just addressing social needs instead of militarization and repression. And so the abolition of the armed forces in Costa Rica is really a landmark. And now there are only a handful of countries in the world that have abolished or have never established a standing army, and most of them are tiny. If you look at the list of countries that have done this, many of them are Pacific Islands. So these are very tiny countries, and the number of sort of slightly larger countries like Costa Rica with a population of about 5 million, and Panama with a population again of about 5 million, are sort of stand out in this class. There are no large countries in the world that have abolished their standing armies. Iceland is a country that actually, Panama and Iceland are two countries that I have been to, which have abolished their armies. Panama more recently in the 60s. Iceland is a smaller country. I mean, it's a population of about 380,000. So most of it, we don't often realize that how small its population is. Less than the population of Oakland. But when I went to Iceland, one of the things that I really could feel everywhere. I mean, from the moment that I landed at the airport, first of all, I never saw a gun in the airport. I never saw a gun in my entire trip to Iceland, whether it was on a policeman or a civilian. I never saw a gun. Now, it doesn't mean they don't have guns. Their hunting is a favorite sport in Iceland, but people have a very good sense of that guns are only for hunting. They're not. So people don't acquire assault weapons like they do here. And the police, there undoubtedly are reserve police forces that can be brought out if there were to be an armed threat. But you see the other aspects of the society. Education is very high. I mean, everybody is so not just literate but multilingual. I mean, every person in Iceland speaks multiple Scandinavian languages, and there's actually a lot of people who go back and forth between Iceland and Norway, Sweden, Denmark, and of course everybody speaks English. So very educated, just like Costa Rica, and you see that in the quality of life, the quality of the housing, the fact that there's no homelessness, there's very little personal debt, because the resources are put into the society, and the whole the narrative is really about how do we meet human needs. And there are different ways of meeting human needs, as we see from one country to another. Some continue to use a market-based system, and and others, of course, go towards a centrally planned type of system. So either one meets human needs, but the issue is of course that depending upon what type of system you adopt, that could elicit some kind of a negative response from the United States. But I really want to get into more of an audience discussion here of the film, and I want to maybe I'll start by posing a question as to what do you think? What do you any of the members of the audience think are some of the preconditions that enable a country to abolish its standing army? Could we do that here? Are there certain conditions that are different in Costa Rica, in Panama, in Iceland, that make it easier, make it possible, both physically as well as politically, to abolish the standing army?
It's a good question, Sharat. Does everyone have the ability to raise their hand on the video? And if you're not on the video, if you're by phone, Catherine, how would we know that a hand is raised? Can you tell?
No, they'll just have to speak up. Let's see if they're on the phone. So.
Okay, so I'll start us off by just saying how appalled I am every time I hear and see the long and horrible history of American oppression of these countries, the aggression, the invasion, the bombing, and the results of it. Why can't the American power structure learn that this is not a successful
Bev, you have muted yourself.
Bev, we can't hear you. I'm sorry, I didn't do anything. It just went mute. I won't repeat. I will ask you to raise your hand and answer Sharat's question about how could we achieve such a demilitarization in this country? What do you think are the factors?
Jody, please unmute yourself.
Whoops.
Okay. Go ahead, Jody.
Okay, sorry. My computer suddenly is acting up. Can you hear me?
Yes. Yes.
We can hear you.
All right. It was said in the film, I forget who said it. Someone in Costa Rica said that the reason that they can do it is because when you demilitarize yourself and put down your arms and become non-threatening, somehow there's some magic to that, just as Gandhi was able to do in India and Martin Luther King in his non-violent way, and Desmond Tutu. When you put down your arms, no one, it looks too bad. It's too obvious that you are an oppressor when you attack somebody without any defense. That's what I believe. I think even the United States could do that.
Well, yes. So I think one of the references in the film was that you may not have, you don't have military superiority, but you have this moral superiority.
Exactly.
And it is the moral that moral standing carries weight.
It does.
Yeah.
And you might sustain some violence for a while, but not ultimately.
I like the point that was just when I think they just said it once sort of quickly that the only use of a military such as they might have in Costa Rica would be to take out the president, to have a coup that went in. Then this has happened so often in Central America and South America that if the leader does not please the United States, the U.S. manages to find people who will have a coup. You know, if they have a military, they get to the military and get them to have a coup and get rid of the leader that the U.S. doesn't like. It has nothing to do with democracy in the country, which they get rid of all the democratically elected leaders who don't agree with the United States.
I see Janet has her hand up. Janet?
Thank you. I'm thinking that one reason the United States is a long way from following this idea of a country of peace is capitalism and the amount of money that's behind that. You know, the 99%, all the weaponry, the military, the money, and a big one too is corporate personhood. You know, so I know our fellow Wilf sister Sue Hubbard has moved across the country, but that was her goal is to get rid of corporate personhood. So anyway, thank you.
You're saying that the government doesn't represent the 99%.
No, yeah, that's what I'm saying. It's representing the 1% and the capitalistic whole idea of money, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, I think we have to change some of that before we can just instantly go for peace, you know.
Right.
I mean, even if for no other reason, that the amount of money that's made out of selling all the arms. So,
correct.
Anyway, thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. No, that I think that's a very important point, which brings me to the democratic functioning democratic systems, and I have been observing a number of elections in Latin American countries, and every single one of those elections, I've learned about practices that we could learn from here in the United States about how to run fairer elections and certainly elections without the money that really distorts that has an unfortunate distorting influence. I mean, the point is it's about manipulation. Money is manipulating public opinion, and in many of these countries, there isn't a money factor that warps the results of those elections. And so there's more than one. There's many lessons actually that we here in the U.S. can learn from Latin America, and rather than always lecturing them about exporting democracy to them. So true. As far as the interests that support the military, I think you've hit the nail on the head. It's about the military-industrial complex. It's not just about capitalism, because Costa Rica has the overall economy is still a market-based economy. So there is capitalism in Costa Rica. There's also a public sector, right? Because there were certain industries or certain assets of transnational corporations that were nationalized. But it's basically a mixed economy. And so it's not capitalism alone. It has, partly has to do with monopoly capital. So Costa Rica being a rather small country, it doesn't have giant multinational corporations that have no connection essentially to the community. And I think that that's a distorting factor. It doesn't have a military industrial complex. It doesn't have it, you know, even back in 1949, it didn't have it didn't have any kind of, to speak of, any kind of arms industry that would have supported the continuance of the armed forces. So these are just some of the factors. Any other thoughts?
Okay, Klein. Okay, would you unmute yourself?
I was really shocked to see all the U.S. corporations in Costa Rica. I had no idea that was happening, and to really realize how these corporations have become global and the power that they have and how that affects things. And to think that Costa Rica seemed in the beginning more able to really hold on to their own image, and to have our corporations coming in like that, and little businesses closing, and we see it happening here too, and that's just a huge concern for me.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, I had the experience when we went to Costa Rica for bird watching and tourism. I contacted, there's a government agency that connects tourists with TICO-owned businesses so that you don't participate in foreign-owned corporate tourism. And we had a most wonderful experience. And I would urge that people think about that in many countries. It may be possible that you can avoid the big corporate interests when tourism starts up again. Do I see any hands up?
I'll say something.
Yes.
Okay, I was just going to mention something about the military-industrial complex. I attended a webinar just recently. It was Ann Wright and a lot of people talking about Trump's decision to pull troops from Iraq. Okay, anyway, someone brought this up, and they call it's, instead of the military-industrial complex, he called it the military-industrial congressional intelligence media academia think tank complex. And just to say how pervasive all of this is and how much is at stake. I mean, look at how the media just thrives on the political unrest. You know, if it bleeds, it leads. And over the past 4 years, how strong a role they've played in our political system. So that creates a lot of fear. I believe that would be one obstacle for, stop abolishing an army, a standing army, and demilitarizing. That fear factor is so strong, and it's just by design, because it sells. It's a cash cow.
Janet?
Hi. In the background, you'll hear my cat tearing up tissue paper, but I had another question. In the film, it mentioned how it was important to keep the economy with a big middle class. You know, that if it all became totally lopsided, that would cause more problems. And I'm wondering, in regards to that, what, if any, effect it's having all these tourists from the United States of America and other countries that, you know, are basically rich people going down and kind of like living buying homes, and, you know, that raises the property. You know, I mean, I haven't been to Costa Rica. I have been to Mexico many times, and I see what happens down there to small towns when they become expat communities. And so I'm wondering how that's affecting Costa Rica.
Well, so first of all, there's two aspects to this. One, of course, is the tourism aspect, and of course, tourism is tourism in a third world country, or let's put it, in a way, Costa Rica, in a social aspect, Costa Rica is a first world country. In terms of income, maybe you could say it's a middle income country. But it's less developed, obviously, than the U.S., Canada, and Western Europe, and so the impact of tourism is to create an infrastructure that is not very much used by the local population. So we create these 5-star hotels, these resorts that are beyond the means of most of the citizens of Costa Rica, and the tourism infrastructure employs, it basically creates a lot of low wage jobs.
Yeah.
And so that's why, if you've ever been to Cancun, you see the separation between the hotels on the strip and then all the workers living in town. You see it in Atlantic City also, Atlantic City, New Jersey.
Monterey.
Yeah. Sure. Yeah. So it's not really good for the social fabric of the country. The other aspect, of course, are the expat, the impact of an expat community, and the expat community, maybe it creates some, because it's small compared to the local population, it may add a little bit to the demand for luxury goods.
I hear about razor wire on top of their homes, fences and things like that, just to keep theft down. And
right. Well, there is that too. So what happens in many expat communities, particularly if they come from wealthier countries, is that there is a failure to really integrate, and they sort of create their own communities. And it's not just expats; it's also people who have, like, for example, in India, there are what we call NRI communities. So these are overseas Indians that have gone to Britain, to the US, and then they decide to return to India, but they don't want to go into traditional communities. They want modern houses, and so they create these communities in outlying areas that are gated. And same thing though. So it does not do any good for the social harmony, the integration of the society.
Yeah. I think down in Baja, where I go, I think in the beginning it was good because it brought in money, and people were buying things from the local vendors and things like that. But now, as Costco has gone in and all these mega stores, the expats, a lot of them shop there. So it's becoming worse. And then the local people, when their children grow up, they can't afford to buy homes in the close area and things like that. But yeah,
that's true.
I'm looking for a solution to that.
Lynn Hamilton.
I don't know how to do that other hand, but here's my hand.
I see your hand. Please talk.
This is kind of old news. We went to Costa Rica probably 25 or 30 years ago anyway. And one thing that back then anyway, that we noticed was, well, there were a lot of Quakers, American expat Quakers. So, and they were doing a lot of good stuff, and they didn't, well, of course there was no Walmart then, but anyway, I hope that, I'm sure that they were a better group of expats to be there.
They're probably still avoiding Walmarts.
Yeah.
So a related question is so when a country decides to has policies that basically defy what the United States wants them to do, these countries often become targets, and they become enemies of the U.S. government. The U.S. government then cuts off diplomatic relations and starts a blockade or more. It's only in more recent years that sanctions have really become an essential part of U.S. policy towards its so-called adversaries. And so I just wonder what people's thoughts are on how why Costa Rica has avoided that. I mean, Nicaragua has defied U.S. policy, and it has come under sanctions. Cuba and Venezuela, of course, have faced those sanctions for much longer. And any thoughts?
Wow. Well, Costa Rica has such a policy of negotiation. I wonder if that has really been successful, that their political leaders have come to the U.S. and talked to our political leaders and tried to work things out. Maybe they have succeeded in staving off that kind of sanction punishment.
Well, the other thing that the film mentioned was Costa Rica's participation in and respect for international law and the international community, and how much they participate and take their grievances there. And although the US doesn't seem to have a lot of respect for it, world opinion has pretty much stood with them. It appears that they feel, the people in the film felt that that was a big factor in their being able to stand up to the US pressures.
No, these are all factors. They certainly play a role. But if we take, for example, the case of Cuba, where every year there's a resolution that's put up in the United Nations General Assembly, calling for the United States to end the embargo on Cuba. And year after year, it passes almost unanimously with only about 3 negative votes from the United States and typically two Pacific Island countries that are essentially dependencies of the United States, and maybe Israel. So even when world opinion is in favor of that country and against the United States still maintains the embargo, the sanctions, the blockade on Cuba.
One of the most distressing things to me is the lack of education. Whereas if you talk to the average American, I don't think they have any idea of the things that we talk about in this peace community. They have very little comprehension of what the United States has been doing. The ignorance is appalling, and I think such a large percentage of the United States population is incredibly uneducated as to world issues and the United States' role in them. I'm not sure how you can overcome it, but it seems to me these big corporate interests do not want an educated populace. They just want ignorant workers, and they do their best to make that happen.
Yeah. Well, they are, for them, news is a commodity. So whatever they can dramatize and sell. Actually, the news reporting, in my travels around the world, I would say that international news reporting, the amount of international news reporting is inversely proportional to the population. So in other words, in small countries, like Costa Rica, like Panama, like Lebanon, like Denmark. I mean, there's a lot of international news because there is only so much news in a small country, right? So a good portion of the news is going to come from outside that country's borders. If it's a big country like China, India, or the United States, the international reporting is a tiny percentage of what you see in the newspaper, what you see on television, and just because there's a lot of internal news in a giant country. But beyond that, yeah, it's also a question of what kind of education is promoted by the government. If the government is always, if the government wants people to be ignorant because it doesn't want opposition to its policies, that's also going to be a factor. And most of the corporations are not ready. Certainly, the media corporations are not ready to challenge that. So the reason why, at least I'll give you my opinion, why I think that Costa Rica has avoided sanctions and extra economic pressure is because it still has a market economy, so it's still open for investment by U.S. corporations, and that's why you see the Walmarts, the Costco's, and all of these there. Whereas Nicaragua, Cuba, certainly Venezuela, have taken measures to restrict foreign investment, and they've asserted national sovereignty over the planning of their economies. And I think that's one reason. Another reason is because Costa Rica, in the various disputes, has declared neutrality rather than let's say joining ALBA or the initiatives that were led by Venezuela. It said, okay, we're going to be neutral. So it's a little bit harder to attack that opposition of neutrality than it is to attack an opposition grouping. I think those are some of the reasons. And another question is, that because there also are certain risks in abolishing the army. Look what happened to Haiti. As soon as Aristide abolished the armed forces, he was overthrown, and he didn't have an army to defend himself. So what enables Costa Rica to abolish its army and not be attacked from the outside, not have the government be overthrown by some hostile force from the outside? Any thoughts?
Mabel, unmute yourself.
Yes, I was trying to do that. I was just thinking of Switzerland, which is also a small country, and it also doesn't have, well, it has a reserve army, but it's also neutral. It's self-declared neutral in many ways. And how different it is, the case of Switzerland and the case of Costa Rica. And I think there's food for thought there. Switzerland is an incredibly rich country, wealthy, I should say, not rich in natural resources as much as wealthy. How did Switzerland manage to get that way? Costa Rica also may be blessed by a lack of rare minerals or petroleum or whatever. It has a lot of national parks, and I think I was there 25 years ago. And for me, coming from Argentina, that has been a country that has been ruled by militaries back and forth for so many times and so many years, stepping on Costa Rica and just breathing, wow, what is here? Oh, they don't have any, they don't have an army, that's what it is. And it felt so free and so like, you don't have to be afraid of anything. It just, wow. What I was saying with a little sarcasm is that by being blessed by a lack of things that other countries may want, and by keeping its fingers out of, conflict in general, I would like to know if other countries that are rich in, for example, Bolivia is a small country, not very strong, and has all kinds of interesting and desirable rare minerals and gold and stuff in the Andes, and they have hardly been able to keep, the corporations out. So I don't know. I don't have an answer. I just have questions about this. But I would like Sharat Lin to have your, what do you think about this? These are different countries with different circumstances. Uruguay is another small country that hardly has any army or hardly could defend itself. And again, Uruguay doesn't have a lot of desirable stuff because it's so small, except wonderful beaches and good meat. But what do you think, Sharat?
Well, so for one thing, the neutrality is one factor. It means that you're not, taking any kind of a very polarizing position in international politics that would, greatly alienate a neighbor or a foreign power. Another one has to do with the nature of the neighboring countries. So the two neighboring countries in the case of Costa Rica are Panama and Nicaragua. And of course, Panama was going in the same direction until the 60s when it actually did abolish its army. And so that means that right now there's no threat. There's no military threat from the south. In the case of Nicaragua, you have these changes of government between the Sandinistas and a non-Sandinista government. And so the focus, I think, in Nicaragua is more inward about how to carry on social change in the face of U.S. imperialism. And so for the most part, there's not going to be an aggression except that one case, from Nicaragua. And in the case of Iceland, in Iceland, of course, it's an island. And so they're not going to have a border problem. And another thing that comes to my mind is that Iceland has this relative homogeneity of the population, being all essentially all of Scandinavian origin. So much of the population of Iceland actually came from Norway and Sweden originally. So it's relatively homogeneous. In the case of Costa Rica, one of the features of Costa Rica is that it did not have a significant indigenous population. And so without an indigenous population, so what happens in many other societies? What happens in Guatemala, in Honduras, in Nicaragua, in Mexico, is that when the Spanish came, there was the establishment of this hierarchy, and the indigenous peoples were at the bottom, and they were the ones who would do the menial labor, who would be the serving class, and the Europeans would be on top. In the case of Costa Rica, because there was so little indigenous population, when the Spanish came and then other immigrants came, they had to do the manual labor. They had to do this themselves. And so you have sort of a foundation that's created where class did not correlate with ethnicity. And so at its social foundation, there isn't that division. So the class basis of Costa Rica it doesn't have, some of those contradictions. Even though today what we're seeing as a trend is that inequality is increasing in Costa Rica. It's Gini coefficient, which is a measure of social inequality, is increasing. It's actually slightly above the world average. So, but anyway, these are some of the things that come to my mind about it. Anyone else have something? Yes, go ahead.
I also, so later in the 1800s, there was an influx of migrants from the Caribbean, the Black Eastern Costa Rican people. And I'm wondering, I don't really know, I'm wondering if what you know, how that has worked out in the last 20 years or 30 years. The people from Haiti and other Caribbean islands that came to Costa Rica.
So I don't know. I don't have any experience there, and I haven't read about it. But it's quite probable that as new immigrants they would be coming in and filling the lower income jobs, at least in that part of on the East Coast anyway.
So I think you're referring to the area of Puerto Limón, Lynn.
Puerto Limón, yeah.
Yeah, Puerto Limón is it's like you go to a different country. The rest of Costa Rica is more or less homogeneously white, and Puerto Limón is mostly Black Africans. And I understood when I visited that Puerto Limón had been a slave harbor, a slave trade harbor, I should say. And that's why there was such a difference in ethnicity at in that area. And I don't know, because I wasn't there too long, and it was 25 years ago, I don't know how it mixes. So I visited the West Coast, the East Coast, and the Center. I visited almost all of the country, but very briefly, maximum 2 weeks or something like that. I noticed what you referred to.
Yeah.
But Sharat, what I was referring to earlier was the contrast of different countries that are small, neutral, or I was thinking also, for example, New Zealand. New Zealand has like something like 4.5 million people in all. They have declared themselves non-nuclear. Are a couple of big islands. They're such an example. They're absolutely a non-bellicose country, and avowedly non-nuclear in every way. There are parallels, even though they're different countries in many ways, but there are such parallels with Costa Rica. I don't know that they don't. I suppose they do have an army. I didn't explore that part of New Zealand. It's very much not a homogeneously, ethnically homogeneous country. There's the Maoris, and then there is the Kiwis, and then there is some other people that came later. So there's, but I found quite a bit of harmony in New Zealand, and I think they managed to attain it by keeping foreigners out. They deal with their own problems, and they let you visit, but they don't let you stay. And it's in many ways a wonderful. They create their own wealth.
We're
Yes.
getting close to the end of our time. Do you have a few closing remarks for us, Sharat?
Well, so I just in relation to the last comments about New Zealand. So I mean, I think that the politics of, this is my impression, that the politics of New Zealand are also shifting in a good direction. I mean, with the leadership of the current Prime Minister Ardern, we've seen a lot of good come out of this. And New Zealand wasn't always this way. You know, it was, if you go back to 30, 40 years ago, I mean, New Zealand was part of the ANZUS pact, with the military pact with the US and Australia. But yeah, I mean, New Zealand has the luxury, again, like Iceland, of being an island quite far from any other mainland. And so it can sort of pursue its independent development without fear of external interference, and without the need for a large army. And I think that in any case, you know, these countries, Iceland, as Costa Rica, maybe New Zealand, would be another one it would be really worthwhile to go and you know, see for ourselves these countries, how they're developing, you know, examine their historical development, and see what we can learn. How can we learn something from these societies, and maybe apply some of these lessons wherever they may be relevant to the situation here in the United States, or wherever we live. But I want to thank all of you for joining and in viewing this film, and the interest in this film, and the example that Costa Rica offers to us and to the world for peace and for social justice and for international law. And especially thank WILP and the Peace Coalition of Monterey County for organizing this and having me here. It's been a real pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sharat. We will continue this conversation, I hope, if you will join us at our next film next month, where again, we're talking about groups that try to change the culture. The film is called Disturbing the Peace, and it is a Palestinian-Israeli peace movement and how it formed and what it has accomplished. And very interesting film, I think. It was a 2016 award-winning documentary. We will show it on February 9th at 6 p.m. And I hope you will join us then. Thanks everyone for being here tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you.
See you next month. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.